Dmitry Volkov had a rule: never let anyone see you flinch. Tonight, he broke it without even realizing. The private dining room at Solene sat 40 feet above the city, all glass and gold and hushed conversation, reserved for men who didn't ask permission to reserve anything. His crew filled 3 tables. Wine glasses caught the light. Somewhere near the bar, a waiter refilled a tumbler nobody had touched in 20 minutes because everyone was watching the door instead. They were waiting for a joke to walk in. 3 days earlier, Dmitry had turned to his secretary in the middle of a budget review and said, half laughing, "Amara, black tie dinner, Friday 8 o'clock. Wear something that isn't a cardigan." He hadn't meant it as an invitation. He'd meant it the way a man throws a stone at a duck pond, to watch the ripples, not because he expected the duck to catch it. Amara Chen had looked up from her tablet, unbothered, and said, "Okay." That single word had unsettled him more than he'd admitted to anyone, including himself. Now the door opened, and the room actually went quiet, not the polite quiet of men pretending not to notice something, but the real kind, the kind that happens when a sentence gets interrupted mid-word and nobody bothers finishing it. She wasn't wearing a cardigan. The dress was champagne-colored, cut low enough to matter and high enough to still feel like a decision rather than an accident, slit to the thigh, catching the restaurant's gold light like it had been poured onto her rather than sewn. Her hair fell loose instead of pinned back the way it always was at the office. She walked like she'd done this 1,000 times before, like heels on marble were nothing, like every set of eyes in the room was a temperature she'd already adjusted to. Dmitry set his glass down without drinking from it. Beside him, Yuri leaned over and muttered something that might have been a joke, but Dmitry didn't catch it. He was too busy recalculating something he thought he already knew the answer to. She reached the table and pulled out her own chair before anyone could rise to do it for her. "You said black tie," she said, settling in like she owned the seat. "Clearly." His voice came out steadier than he felt, which was its own small victory. "Something wrong?" Everything about tonight was wrong, in the sense that nothing was going according to the version of the evening he'd sketched out in his head 3 days ago, the version where she showed up flustered, overdressed in the wrong direction, embarrassed enough that he could laugh it off as harmless and move on to the next thing. That version had a punchline. This one didn't. "Nothing's wrong," he said. "I'm just recalibrating." "Recalibrating what?" He didn't answer. Across the table, Yuri was doing a poor job of hiding a grin, and Nikolai, his second, the one who never smiled at anything, was watching Dmitry with an expression that suggested he'd already started keeping score of something. Dinner moved the way dinners with dangerous men tend to move, expensive, unhurried, punctuated by conversations that meant something other than what they said out loud. Amara held her own without trying to. When Grigor, 3 seats down, asked what exactly a secretary did at a place like Volkov Holdings, she answered without hesitation. "Everything he forgets and half of what he doesn't," she said, and didn't look at Dmitry when she said it, which somehow made it land harder. The table laughed. Even Nikolai's mouth moved in something adjacent to amusement. Dmitry found himself watching her hands instead of listening to the rest of the conversation, the way she held her fork like she'd been trained somewhere formal a long time ago, the way she never quite finished her wine, always leaving an inch at the bottom of the glass like a habit she couldn't name. He filed it away without meaning to. He'd spent 6 years learning to read people for a living, and some part of him that never fully switched off was reading her now, cataloging small inconsistencies he couldn't yet name. By dessert, the joke had died a quiet death nobody mentioned out loud. What replaced it didn't have a name yet either, not to Dmitry, not to anyone at that table, but Yuri caught it. He always caught things first. "So," Yuri said later, when they were near the elevators and Amara had gone ahead to find her coat. "That was interesting." It was dinner. It was something. Yuri's grin widened. "You didn't touch your second drink." "I wasn't thirsty." "Sure." Yuri clacked him once on the shoulder, the way he did when he wanted the last word without saying it directly. "That you'd last less than a week before you found a reason to work late with her." "There's no bet." "There's always a bet, boss. You just weren't paying attention to the terms." Dmitry didn't answer that. He watched Amara across the lobby, coat over one arm now, checking her phone with the same unreadable calm she'd walked in with, and he thought, briefly, uselessly, that he'd wanted tonight to prove something about her. Instead, it had proven something about him, and he wasn't ready to say what. He told himself it would pass by Monday. It didn't.
Monday arrived with rain against the office windows and a version of Amara that looked exactly like it had before Friday, Cardigan back on, hair pinned up, tablet in hand, like nothing had happened. Dmitri almost convinced himself he'd imagined the whole evening. Almost. 9 o'clock call moved to 10, she said, setting a folder on his desk without looking up from her notes. Grigor wants to push the Hendricks meeting to Thursday, and there's a courier waiting downstairs who won't say who sent him. Send him up. Already did. He's in reception being intimidated by Nikolai. Nikolai intimidates everyone. It's not personal. Tell that to the courier. She finally glanced at him, and something flickered there. Brief, gone before he could name it. You look tired. I slept fine. I didn't ask if you slept fine. I said you look tired. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, Friday was fun. Was it supposed to be a joke? I know what it was supposed to be. She said it lightly, without accusation, which somehow made it worse. Doesn't mean it can't also be fun. The door clicked shut behind her, and Dmitri sat there longer than the moment warranted, turning her sentence over like a coin he couldn't decide which side of. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm neither of them acknowledged out loud. She'd bring him coffee he hadn't asked for, exactly the way he liked it, and he'd pretend not to notice that she'd learned his preferences without ever once asking what they were. He'd linger in the office past the hour he needed to, inventing reasons. A contract that could wait until morning, a phone call that could have been an email, and she'd stay too, never commenting on why either of them bothered. Their conversations sharpened. What used to be brisk, functional exchanges turned into something closer to sparring, quick, layered, testing for weak spots neither wanted the other to find. You've read this contract 4 times, she said one evening, nodding at the papers on his desk. You're not looking for a mistake. You're stalling. I don't stall. You've been on the same paragraph for 10 minutes. Maybe I like the paragraph. Nobody likes a paragraph about liability indemnification, Dmitri. She crossed her arms, leaning against the door frame like she had all night. What's actually wrong? He set the contract down. Nothing's wrong. I'm thinking.
About the contract? About several things. Care to name one? He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the air between them changed temperature, and then he said, no, and picked the contract back up, and she laughed, short, surprised, real, and left it there. That was how it went. Neither of them said the thing. Both of them circled it, again and again, close enough to feel the heat off it without ever touching it directly. His crew noticed before he let himself admit it. Yuri started making a show of finding excuses to leave the office early whenever Amara was still there, muttering something about giving the boss room to work, which Dmitri ignored with more effort than it should have taken. Nikolai, who rarely commented on anything that wasn't operational, mentioned once, flatly, without inflection, that Dmitri had started smiling at his phone more often than the business warranted. I don't smile at my phone. You did 4 minutes ago. Reading something from her, I'd guess. Nikolai didn't look up from the ledger he was reviewing. Just an observation. Noted. There's a pool now, by the way. Started with Yuri, spread to the rest of the floor. Odds are on before end of quarter. There's no pool. There's a pool, boss. Nikolai finally glanced up, something almost gentle in his expression, which from him counted as an outright declaration. Might want to decide what you're doing before someone else decides it for you. Dmitri didn't answer that either, but the words stuck to him longer than he wanted. It came to a head on a Thursday, unplanned, the way most true things do. Amara stayed late finishing a report neither of them needed finished that night, and he stayed to keep her company under the thin pretense of reviewing numbers he already knew by heart. Rain streaked the windows again. It always seemed to be raining lately, or maybe he'd just started noticing weather the way people notice things when their attention has nowhere else useful to go. Can I ask you something? She said, not looking up from her laptop. You're going to, whether I say yes or no? Fair. A small smile. Why'd you actually invite me to that dinner? He thought about lying. It would have been easy. A joke, a shrug, some line about testing morale. Instead, he said, I wanted to see if you'd say yes. I did say yes. I know. That's the part I didn't plan for. She finally looked up at him, and for a moment, neither of them said anything else. The silence stretching taut enough that either one of them breaking it first would have meant something neither was ready to name. Then her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the spell, and she glanced at it, and whatever had almost happened folded itself back into the ordinary shape of a Thursday night. But it didn't disappear, it just waited. 2 weeks later,
Dimitri decided he was done pretending. He'd built an empire on decisiveness, on reading a room, calculating risk, moving before hesitation could cost him anything that mattered. Somehow it had taken him a month to apply that same instinct to the one situation sitting closest to him. He told himself it was overdue. He told himself a lot of things that month, most of them just thin cover for the fact that he was, for possibly the first time in years, afraid of getting something wrong. He decided to do it properly. No jokes this time, no dares dressed up as invitations. He'd take her somewhere real, say the thing out loud, let the chips land where they landed. He never got the chance. The ambush came on a Tuesday, 3 blocks from the warehouse where Dimitri's people moved product nobody wrote down on paper. The Kovalenko family had been circling for months, probing for weak points, and they found one, a shipment route Dimitri had trusted to a driver who'd apparently trusted someone he shouldn't have. Gunfire cracked through a loading bay that was supposed to be empty at that hour. 2 of his men went down. Nikolai took a graze along his forearm that would need stitches and a story neither of them wanted to tell twice. In the chaos afterward, police sirens threading closer, Yuri barking orders into a phone, the metallic smell of the night settling over everything, Dimitri found the one piece of information that mattered more than the rest combined. The Kovalenkos hadn't stumbled onto that route by accident. Someone had told them. The trail, when Nikolai dug into it over the following 2 sleepless days, led somewhere Dimitri didn't want it to lead. Encrypted files, a burner line that pinged off a tower 2 blocks from his own building, at hours that lined up too neatly with nights Amara had stayed late finishing reports.
"There's more," Nikolai said, laying a folder on the desk with the particular carefulness of a man delivering news he already knew would break something. "She's not who she said she was when you hired her. Background's clean on the surface. Too clean. We dug past the surface." Dimitri opened the folder. Photographs. Federal credentials under a different name. Special Agent Amara Reyes, not Chen. 18 months embedded. A task force built specifically to dismantle Volkov Holdings from the inside out. Surveillance logs. Transcripts of meetings she'd sat quietly through with her tablet and her unreadable calm, feeding information up a chain that had been closing around him for a year and a half. He read it twice, then a third time because some stubborn part of him kept expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something less true. "She was there from the beginning," Nikolai said. Quiet, none of his usual flatness in it now. Before the dinner, before any of it. "I know how to read a timeline, Nikolai. I'm not saying it to hurt you. I'm saying it because you need to hear it from someone before you hear it from her." Dimitri didn't answer. He was looking at a photograph clipped near the back of the file. Amara in a plain blazer, years younger, standing outside a federal building he recognized from news coverage he'd half paid attention to once. A different woman, technically. The same eyes. "Where is she now?" he said finally. "Building. Her office. She doesn't know we know yet." Something cold settled into Dimitri's chest, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself as anger or grief, but as a kind of total recalculation. Every warm evening, every unguarded laugh, every inch of wine left in a glass she never finished, all of it running back through his memory and coming out the other side stripped of whatever meaning he'd assigned it. He'd let a stranger closer than he'd let anyone in a decade, and the stranger had been counting the ways to end him the entire time. He walked to her office without deciding to. His legs simply carried him there while the rest of him was still catching up. She looked up when he opened the door, and whatever she saw on his face told her everything before he said a word. Her expression didn't crumble the way I half expected. It went still instead, but particular stillness of someone who spent 18 months preparing for a moment they hoped would never come, and finding now that it had, preparation didn't make it survivable.
"Dimitri? Don't." His voice came out lower than he intended, rough at the edges. "Don't say my name like that. Not now. Let me explain." "Explain what? That you've been feeding a federal task force everything that happens in this building for a year and a half? That the dinner, the coffee, all of it?" He stopped, jaw tight, unable to finish the sentence, because finishing it meant admitting how much of it he'd let himself believe was real. "It's not what you think," she said, standing now, hands open at her sides like she was trying to prove she wasn't reaching for anything. "Not all of it. Please, just let me. 2 of my men are in a hospital right now,
because someone gave the Kovalenkos a route only a handful of people knew. His voice cracked once, sharp, before he pulled it back under control. Was that you too? No. The word came out fast, certain. The first thing she'd said since he walked in that didn't sound careful. No, Dmitri, I swear to you that wasn't me. Why should I believe anything you swear? She didn't have an answer for that. Not one she could give him standing in a doorway with his men bleeding somewhere behind them both. He didn't have her arrested. He didn't call Nikolai in to handle it the way Nikolai would have handled anyone else who'd betrayed him this completely. He simply walked out of her office and locked himself in his own. And for 2 days, he didn't speak to her at all. Amara didn't run. That was the detail that kept snagging in Dmitri's mind whenever he tried to make sense of what he was feeling. A person with a federal case against him half-built already, caught, exposed. That person runs, calls for backup, disappears into the machinery of whatever agency sent her. She did none of it. She kept showing up. She sat at her desk every morning, kept the coffee coming even though he never touched it, and waited for him to either destroy her or hear her out, giving no indication which outcome she expected. It was Yuri, of all people, who finally pushed him toward the second option. You're not actually going to just leave her sitting out there, Yuri said, dropping into the chair across from Dmitri's desk without being invited. It's been 2 days. The whole floor is walking on eggshells. Even Nikolai's on edge, and Nikolai doesn't get on edge. She's a federal informant, Yuri. She's a federal informant who didn't run when she had every chance to, who didn't call in backup during that ambush, even though backup could have swept in and cleaned house while everyone was still bleeding on the ground. Yuri leaned forward. Ask yourself why a trained agent does that. Then ask yourself if you actually want the answer, or if it's easier to just be angry.
Dmitri didn't respond, but he didn't throw Yuri out either, which for him counted as consideration. That night, after most of the building had emptied, he went back to her office. She was still there. Of course she was. Going through the same file for what looked like the 10th time. A file he recognized from the folder Nikolai had handed him days earlier. Except this version had annotations. Her handwriting, cramped and urgent, crossing out lines, circling dates, question marks stacked in the margins, like she'd been arguing with herself for months. "What is that?" he said. She looked up, startled, then composed herself with visible effort. "My case file, the real one, not the one I gave my supervisors." "There's a difference?" "There's a significant difference." She turned the laptop toward him, revealing a spreadsheet of dates, most of them from the last 4 months. "I was supposed to have you flagged for federal indictment 3 months ago. I had enough. Wire transfers, meeting logs, 2 witnesses willing to testify. I sat on it." "Why?" "Because every time I sat down to write the final report, I couldn't finish it." Her voice wavered, just slightly, the first real crack he'd seen in her since this started. "I started leaving things out. Small at first. A date here, a name there, then bigger. I told my supervisor the wire transfer records were inconclusive when they weren't. I said a source had gone cold when they hadn't. I stalled every deadline they gave me, invented complications that didn't exist, because closing this case meant you'd be gone, and I couldn't." She stopped, swallowed, started again. "I couldn't be the reason for that. Not anymore." Dmitri stood very still. "You falsified federal evidence." "Yes. For 18 months, you were supposed to be building a case against me, and somewhere in there you started building the opposite. Somewhere around the 2nd month, actually." A small, humorless laugh escaped her. "Long before the dinner. Long before any of this got complicated in ways I couldn't control." "Why tell me now? You could have kept stalling, kept me in the dark, kept feeding them just enough to look competent, protected yourself either way." "Because you deserve to know the truth is worse and better than you think." She stood, closing the laptop, facing him fully now. "Worse, because I really was sent here to end everything you've built. Better, because somewhere along the way, ending it stopped being something I wanted. I fell for you before I ever meant to, Dmitri, and I spent months trying to convince myself that was a liability I could manage. I couldn't." The room went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence of the past 2 days, less like a wall between them, and more like the held breath before something finally moves.
"The Kovalenko ambush?" he said. "You said it wasn't you." "It wasn't. I don't know who leaked that route, but it wasn't me, and I intend to find out, because whoever it was put your men in danger and made you doubt the one thing I actually have left to offer you, which is the truth." She met his eyes without flinching. "I know what I did. I know it doesn't erase the 18 months before it, but everything since that first dinner has been real. All of it." He studied her for a long moment.
the file open on the desk between them, the annotations that told a story no federal report ever would. The woman who'd walked into a room full of dangerous men in a champagne dress and never once looked like she needed protecting. "I believe you," he said finally, and something in his chest loosened for the first time in 2 days. "Now we need to find out who actually leaked that route, because someone in this building wanted us both looking at each other instead of them." They found the leak 4 days later, and it wasn't the twist either of them expected. Amara pulled it apart the way she'd been trained to, methodically, cross-referencing tower pings against building access logs, narrowing a list of 40 possible names down to 3, then 1. Piotr Volkov, Dmitri's cousin. A man who'd sat at that same dinner table the night of the black-tie dare, who'd smiled and toasted and said nothing while quietly negotiating with the Kovalenkos for a piece of territory Dmitri had never been willing to hand over. "He's been talking to them for 6 weeks, Amara said, sliding the printout across the desk. "Wanted the e-stocks. When you said no, he found another way to get them." Dmitri read it once, jaw tight, and didn't say much. Some betrayals don't need commentary. Piotr disappeared from the organization within the week. Where exactly, nobody in the crew asked out loud, and Dmitri never offered details. What mattered was that the ambush stopped being a mystery, and the shadow it had cast over Amara lifted with it. Nikolai, healing arm and all, was the one who finally said what everyone else had been circling. "She didn't sell us out," he told Yuri over coffee one morning, loud enough for half the floor to hear. "Family did. Funny how that works." The federal case took longer to untangle than the leak had. Amara's supervisors weren't pleased with 18 months of stalled progress and suddenly surfacing inconsistencies, and for a while it looked like she'd trade one kind of danger for another. An internal investigation, a possible charge of obstruction, a career she'd built since law school collapsing under the weight of a decision she'd never regretted making. Dmitri wasn't willing to let that happen quietly. "There's a file," he told her one evening, 3 weeks after the ambush, the two of them alone in his office with the lights low and the city spread out beyond the windows like something that no longer felt as threatening as it once had. The one that could still finish what you started. Falsified evidence, stalled reports, proof of everything you'd need to bury yourself if it ever surfaced.
"I know what's in it, Dmitri. I wrote it. I want to burn it." She looked at him carefully. "That's not how this works. There are backups, systems. It's not one folder in a drawer. I know how systems work." A faint, wry edge crept into his voice. "I've spent a career finding ways around them. Give me 48 hours. It took closer to 72, and it wasn't clean. Nothing involving federal databases and encrypted servers ever is. But between Dmitri's resources and Amara's insider knowledge of exactly where the vulnerability sat, the file that could have ended either of their lives as they knew it stopped existing. Not erased in some symbolic, poetic sense, actually gone. Every backup, every trace, scrubbed by people who understood precisely what they were destroying and why. They stood together afterward on the office balcony, the physical copy, the one last paper trail, the folder Nikolai had first laid on Dmitri's desk, held between them over a metal trash bin. Amara struck the match herself. "Any regrets?" Dmitri asked, watching the flame catch the edge of the paper. "About the case or about you?" "Either. None." She dropped the burning pages into the bin and watched them curl into ash, the light briefly catching the gold in her eyes. "I spent 18 months building a case to destroy you, and somewhere in the middle of it, I built something I actually wanted to keep instead. I'm not sorry it turned out this way."
"Neither am I." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed saying. The city moved beneath them, indifferent and enormous, the way it always had, but up on that balcony, two people who'd spent a year and a half lying to everyone around them, including themselves, finally stopped. They didn't walk away from what they'd built separately. He didn't fold his empire to become someone smaller and safer for her sake, and she didn't return to the version of her life that existed before that first dinner, the version where her name was Reyes and her only job was ending him. Instead, they built something new out of the wreckage, not one of them saving the other, not one of them surrendering to protect the other, but two people who'd seen each other clearly since that very first night in a champagne dress, choosing, deliberately and without illusion, to stay. Months later, when Yuri finally collected on the bet nobody would admit existed, he raised a glass at another dinner, this one without an audience of curious crew members placing side bets, without a joke buried underneath it, just Dmitri and Amara
and a room that finally felt like it belonged to both of them equally. "To recalibrating," Yuri said, grinning, glass raised toward Dmitri. Amara laughed, the same real laugh from that first Thursday night, and Dmitri, for once in his life, didn't argue with the toast. If you made it this far, you already know how rare a story like this actually is. Drop a comment telling us which twist got you the most, hit subscribe for more stories exactly like this one, and we'll see you in the next one.